What inspiration can a fiction writer draw from working in a shopping mall? Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah joins us to talk about his debut short story collection, Friday Black. In what ways have we abandoned the principles of the founders of this country? Historian Joseph Ellis will be here to talk about his latest book, American Dialogue, The Founders and Us. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the publishing world. Plus, our critics Dwight Garner, Parth Siegel, and Jennifer Salai will join us to talk about the latest in literary criticism. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah joins us now from Syracuse, where he is based, but in the middle of a book tour for his debut short story collection, Friday Black. Nana, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I really do appreciate it.
Well, tell us about the genesis of this collection. When did you start writing these stories? What time period do they cover?
So the oldest stories in this book are about 6 years old now, 5, 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
I was just getting ready to be out of college. I was sort of coming to a space where I was admitting I wanted to be a writer and not really sure what that meant or not really confident that I could claim something like that. Luckily, I had some mentors and professors who sort of were able to push me a little bit, specifically at Albany, at least, Lynn Tillman and Ed Schwarzschild. And, I started thinking of myself, maybe this is something I could do too.
When did you start to think of yourself as a writer? Like, what were you thinking before then?
Before that, I thought books were sort of these magic things that came from sort of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I was aware of these writers, were sort of immortalized in those murals in Barnes and Nobles or whatever bookstore. It didn't seem something like I could touch, something that a regular person could aspire to be to. And so prior to me really sort of claiming wanting to be an author, wanting to be a writer, I sort of thought I was just making things, and I was sort of following like a compulsion just 'cause, and I didn't really feel super possible. And then eventually something shifted, and I was like, I'm writing these with the intention that hopefully they'll be read.
Mm-hmm. Well, you raised the question of what is a regular person, but we won't go into that because that would be a whole other conversation. But one of the reasons I asked you about the time period is because these are stories that feel very much of the moment, but there have been so many pivotal points recently in terms of where our country is politically, socially, culturally, racially, both in general and specific to African Americans, that I kind of wanted to know where these stories fit into that. Were there stories that were inspired by particular events? Were
Right.
there ones that you then, returned to and said, this changes things? Or how did that work?
I was actually in college when Trayvon Martin was murdered. And I think, a lot of people my age, that marked a shift in my consciousness. I sort of started looking at the world a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
Back then, I had my sort of creative response. I made a pamphlet, and I thought we were gonna save the world with it. And I anonymously distributed it around the campus, me and one of my great friends. And I went to bed sort of thinking, well, we did it. We fixed racism today. And when I woke up, obviously, the world was still as it was. We had pretty much just littered. And I think that something about that struck me. I remember thinking, I don't like this. I don't like that I couldn't do anything. So since then, on some level, it's always been on my mind. And it's, Black people being murdered is unfortunately a constant in this country.
Mm-hmm.
And murder with impunity, it's something that happens constantly, and so I'm constantly that's constantly on my mind. But and it has been since then, and so some of these stories respond to that, I think, very specifically.
You recently wrote an essay for the Paris Review, a great essay, so listeners, Google it now, that was titled, "Why Do I Write Political Stories?" And it was a great headline, and it's a great question. And I know that in that essay, you wrote, "Why am I constantly being asked that question?" And yet I am going to ask it again here. Why do you write political stories?
For me, it's if the house is on fire, I'm not going to write about what's in the fridge.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, the second, my feeling is what should I write? How do I not write a political story? as a black person in this country, how do I not write a political story? Like, literally. And so for me, I think it's hard for me to even understand what an apolitical work of art is in a time like this, but at any time, at any place when just thinking about the way identity intersects with culture and society. I'm curious about how to do it, because if I could, that'd be great.
You could write about rainbows and sunshine.
Yeah, but and even the ability to do that, to write about rainbows as your brother is dead on the floor, there's something political to that for me as well.
One of the things you wrote in that essay, it was a great line. You wrote, "I'm interested in the way we dehumanize each other." Tell us a little bit more about that.
Often people ask me, like, who's sort of like the bad guy in your story? Like, who's like the enemy? What are you trying to, like, if there's, because I think we often are made to think about us or them, this or that. And I think for my stories, I often try to, for me, not even that I try, but what often emerges through revision and through working stories closely, trying to really get to looking at all my characters with sort of love and empathy, even maybe the worst of them often. What comes up is these different systems that sort of squeeze people into forgetting that the person that they think is other from them is a human too. And so whether that be race, whether that be, I want that TV, you want that TV, I'm going to tramp you to death for it, whatever it is, in that case, capitalism, like these different systems that we sort of allow to trick us into forgetting each of us is a human with the capacity to love, to feel, to hurt, just as much as the same capacity that we have. There's the different systems that allow us to, like, sort of forget that. I'm interested in sort of interrogating those.
I'm so glad that you brought up the shopping mall, because I know that you worked in a mall. I worked in a mall in junior high school and high school and after school, and you learned so much there. Obviously, you learned a lot there and addressed a lot of that in your stories. And I'm curious to what extent your work is a critique of that consumer culture.
For sure, it is on some level a critique of this endless consumerism, this sort of the conflation of things and love, maybe specifically the way that marketers, and sort of, again, capitalism as a whole kind of gets us to believe that because we have these things, we are somehow greater than anybody else, because or maybe that we are not worthy until we have the ability to acquire things endlessly, that we can't show anyone, quite literally, that we love them unless we purchase some item.
Mm-hmm.
It's a dangerous game. And I think in this book, I often sort of harp on the more obvious ways in which that manifests into something violent and evil.
Mm-hmm.
People literally in real life trample other human beings to get to electronics. For me, just, again, like, it seems like something we should talk about. And it's sort of like almost normalized. But to me, it's like, well, that seems weird that people killed each other trying to get these shoes or that TV or whatever it is. It's so normal that it's almost like, yeah, no, that's just a part of the game. And I'm interested in, like, maybe saying, like, hold on a second.
That brings us to the title story in the book, with the great inversion in your title there, Friday Black. Tell us a little bit about that story.
Friday Black features a protagonist that is a salesperson in a clothing store. Black Friday, the biggest shopping day in America.
Coming up.
The shoppers are zombie-fied, blood-lusting, totally mindless sort of lunatics, and they're screaming, they're foaming at their mouth, but because he has been bitten by one of them, literally, he sort of understands them in a way that maybe some people don't.
Do you consider your book to be satire?
I do, I guess, at some level, yeah. The genre thing is really interesting to me because I've been labeled a bunch of things: satire, surreal, or realism, or all these other, sci-fi. And I don't think about any of those things in the process of writing. Mm-hmm. But I do think there is satirical elements, that is, using maybe hyperbole to make a point that is on some way political. Yeah, I think a lot of these stories are sort of satirical.
I mean, there's a lot of reality in there too. You seeing people be bodily injured to get a pair of jeans, and in the story version, there's someone like literally raking bodies to the side. Do you see satire as just kind of turning the needle a bit on some actually very real, brutal things?
Absolutely. For me, that's exactly what it is. I turn the volume up just a bit, and then often after I've written the story, I realize, oh, maybe I didn't turn the volume up at all or enough. I think a lot of my stories operate right in that space between hyperbole and the actual, and I think they kind of make you think, well, is that what's happening? Is it not? And sometimes it might be just that I'm coloring the details in a little brighter than what is actual, while maintaining sort of the heart and fact of what actually happens. That is, maybe I'm having these people speak like zombies, which maybe doesn't necessarily happen, but people really do trample each other to death for TVs, though.
Speaking of turning up the needle, you have this great device in your book, the blackness dial. And I'd love to sort of get a sense of where you got that idea, because it's one of those things that you think, why didn't anyone do this before or think of this before? And maybe
Yep.
before you answer that question, can you read a little bit from that story?
Absolutely. So the first story of my book is called The Finkelstein Five. I'll read a little bit from the beginning of that. Phila, the headless girl, walked toward Emmanuel, her neck jagged with red savagery. She was silent, but he could feel her waiting for him to do something, anything. Then his phone rang, and he woke up. He took a deep breath and set the blackness in his voice down to a 1.5 on a 10-point scale. Hi there, how are you doing today? Yes, I did recently inquire about the status of my application. Well, all right. Okay, great to hear. I'll be there. Have a spectacular day. Emmanuel rolled out of bed and brushed his teeth. The house was quiet. His parents had already left for work. That morning, like every morning, the first decision he made regarded his blackness. His skin was a deep, constant brown. In public, when people could actually see him, it was impossible to get his blackness down anywhere near 1.5. If he wore a tie, wingtip shoes, smiled constantly, used his indoor voice, and kept his hands strapped and calm at his sides, he could get his blackness down as low as 4.0. Though Emmanuel was happy about scoring the interview, he also felt guilty about feeling happy about anything. Most people he knew were still mourning the Finkelstein verdict. After 28 minutes of deliberation, a jury of his peers had acquitted George Wilson Dunn of any wrongdoing whatsoever. He had been indicted for allegedly using a chainsaw to hack off the heads of 5 black children outside the Finkelstein Library in Valley Ridge, South Carolina. The court had ruled that because the children were basically loitering and were not actually inside the library reading, as one might expect of productive members of society, it was reasonable that Dunn had felt threatened by these 5 black young people, and thus he was well within his rights when he protected himself, his library-loaned DVDs, and his children by going into the back of his Ford F-150 and retrieving his Hawtech Pro 18-inch 48cc chainsaw.
All right, then. Where did you get that idea for the blackness dial?
Often my way into what might be a surrealist conceit is just literalizing and making concrete sort of abstract or an abstract concept or something that you experience mentally. So I think code switching, is pretty familiar for most people, and for black people especially. I think code switching is something you are trained to do just to move through any particular professional space or any space, actually. And so the blackness scare was me sort of making that sort of code switching process literal and specific. Again, and making it sort of surreal and, for me, absurd because, of course, blackness is not quantifiable. Blackness is so many different things. But when you are thinking about it from the perspective of someone who fears you, you know what sort of stereotypes they are sort of attributing to blackness, and you sort of may or may not adjust accordingly.
Such a brilliant idea. On the cover of your book, there's a great blurb from George Saunders, calls the book An Excitement and a Wonder. Seems like a very apt description. You mentioned earlier mentors as an undergrad at Albany. You also studied with George Saunders. How much of an influence was he on your work, and what was the most valuable thing that he taught you?
George had so many different professors who have like really, really helped my work grow in so many different ways, and whether it be Dennis Biota, Arthur Flowers, Mary Carr, Bruce Smith, Brooks Haxton, so many people. But with George, he was my thesis advisor. I worked very closely with him. I admired him even coming into the program. He's a big part of the reason why I came to Syracuse to study. But I think it's great because he has a incredible spirit of generosity. He's a very, very kind person. That helped me be comfortable being around him, because in the beginning I was just like, sort of like shook because he's, so genius or whatever.
He's George Saunders.
Yeah.
I want to go beyond the political for just a moment and talk a little bit about maybe more personally, what are your motivations for writing? And do you think of yourself as writing for someone in particular?
I don't have a very specific idea of like a specific person, but I do hope that, people who come from places like where I've come from. I was born in Queens. I'm from a place called Spring Valley, Rockland County, a minority community with public schools that are underserved and that often don't have enough. I would like to help people from those kind of places feel like, they can do anything that they want. I would hope that generally, though, stories like mine might radicalize people's imaginations, might help them feel like this world that we have, though often terrible, is beautiful, and it could be even more beautiful if we were willing to do some work. We're willing to see what's to be seen, we're willing to reject these different systems that ask us so persistently to not see each other as human.
Well, I think this book shows that fiction can do that. Nana, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. It's really kind of you to have me.
Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah is the author of a debut collection of short stories. It's getting a lot of high praise, and it's called Friday Black. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Joining us now from Amherst, Massachusetts, Joseph Ellis, the Pulitzer Prize-winning, National Book Award-winning historian, author of many books from Founding Brothers to American Sphinx, one of my favorites. And his latest book is called American Dialogue, The Founders and Us. Joe, thanks so much for being here.
Pamela, thanks so much for having me.
So I think of you, and I think many of your readers think of you as an historian of the founders. Many books, I mentioned a few, also The Quartet, Revolutionary Summer, First Family. This is a really different book. What did you do in this book that was new for you?
It is, and you're right to say that. In the past, I've stayed in the 18th century. I'm supposedly a scholar of the founding era and write books for people that want to go back to that place to try to understand how we had this revolution and created the first nation-sized republic in world history, and a gallery of people, all flawed, but all great, or many great. But I'm also a citizen, alive and well in 21st century America, who has come to the conclusion that we're living through an extremely troubled time and don't have a clear sense of our direction, that manifest destiny is no longer manifest, and that there's several endemic problems, economic, political, foreign policy problems that seem to be afflicting us. The election of Donald Trump has sort of raised these things to relief, but even before Trump was a person whose name we recognized as a political figure, I started to think about this book. This was in 2014, and so the book's structure reflects that. There's then, and then there's now. There's then chapters focusing on prominent founders, Jefferson, John Adams, James Madison, and George Washington. And then there's now sections focusing on our problems in race, economic inequality, the law and what we think the law is and the Constitution is, and our direction in foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. And so I'm mixing together my dual identities as a historian and as a citizen and as a person who thinks that perhaps going back to the past, to our founding, will help us achieve some perspective on the problems we face now.
Was there some impetus, something that happened in 2014 that got you thinking about this?
Not a single thing, but that it seemed to me, for example, that we'd become a plutocracy. I was sending people on into political careers in some cases and journalistic careers, and that they were reporting back to me that the gridlock in Washington was rooted in money. And I've got one son the oldest son, who works for the Nature Conservancy, and I'm very aware of the problem of climate change, and thinking that we need to think about the posterity and our grandchildren. And I guess I've got grandchildren, so I'm thinking about what's going to happen to them and the world that they're going to come around and alive to, so that that cluster of issues, and perhaps some others too, bedeviled me.
Mm-hmm.
And I would periodically write pieces that were op-ed pieces for your paper or for the Wall Street Journal or Washington Post. And so I had a kind of identity as a commentator, a journalistic kind of commentator. But I'm putting those two things together here because I think that the past is a place where we can perhaps talk together in a way that we seem incapable of doing right now in the present.
It seems like, and I'm sure this is part of that problem, that there are two opposing strands of revisionism when it comes to the founders. On the one end, in pop culture, perhaps in academia, looking back at the founders saying these guys were not good on race, they were not good on equality, they may not have even been good on democracy itself. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the argument, a revisionist version, in which they say it was all very clear. The founders argued for originalism. The founders argued for limited federal authority over the states. The founders argued against certain forms of addressing inequality.
What you were referring to, Pamela, is a kind of, how do we assess the founding? Is it a great moment or is it a tragic moment? It's both. They do some things extraordinarily well. They are visionary. They create the first nation-sized republic in world history. They create the first society that separates church and state. They're the first government to say there are multiple sources of sovereignty. Those are all marvelous achievements. We create the model for the liberal state in the modern world. But there are tragedies buried in this. That slavery is the original sin, and racism is beneath that sin a pool of prejudice that will never go away. And the Native American experience is essentially genocide in slow motion. These are great men who are flawed, like us. And indeed, if they were gods, or if tongues of fire appeared over their heads to offer them divine inspiration, what in heaven's name would we have to learn from them? And so my whole body of work really is to argue that these are human beings like us from which we have so much to learn, but many of the things we have to learn are things that they couldn't solve themselves. I mean, that one thing that the founding generation could not imagine was a biracial society.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I'm saying in the book is that when you elect a black man as president, as we did with Barack Obama, and there was such talk about arriving at a post-racial America, no, the exact opposite should have been expected, a backlash, which is what we're in now, because there's a significant portion of the American people who've never really accepted the full implications of the civil rights movement. And racism is buried beneath the surface of American society. And now, under our current president, you can play the race card up as well as playing the race card down. And these groups that were peripheral, marginal, right-wing groups are now considered mainstream again. And so that understanding our origins sometimes tells us how to do things and sometimes tells us how difficult it's going to be to get things done.
Let's talk about how you picked which four flawed men among the founders to focus this book on.
It was an odyssey for me. I didn't have a vision of the whole thing at the start. And I knew I wanted to deal with race, and I knew, based on spending 7 years with him, that Jefferson was the man to do it, because he stands astride the two sides of the problem. He is the author of the magic words in American history, the ones that begin, all men are created equal. And that's the centerpiece of the liberal tradition that will eventually lead to the abolitionist movement and civil rights. On the other side, he is a person who firmly believed that blacks and whites could never live together in the same society. And that one of the reasons he wasn't going to take a leadership role in ending slavery is he believed you could not end slavery until you came up with a plan to remove all the blacks from the United States to some distant location. And he wasn't unusual in that regard. That was a view among many abolitionists as well.
Right.
Adams is the only founder who predicts that we're going to have class distinctions based on wealth distribution. He predicts the Gilded Age, and we're now in the second Gilded Age, where embedded economic inequality is the norm.
Mm-hmm.
And he foresees that and understands why that is. And his correspondence with Jefferson on this is very revealing. The inequality is the natural order of a capitalistic economy if you don't redistribute the wealth. Madison is the most interesting guy to understand what America's original intentions were in creating the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and what meanings he gave to words. And let's say the Second Amendment, which I look at closely in the Scalia decision in D.C. versus Heller.
Mm-hmm.
And Washington is the most iconic figure whose farewell address establishes the principle of American isolationism throughout most of the 19th century. But he's also the originator of American realism in foreign policy, that our interests, not our ideals, need to decide our foreign policy future. And so he's also, like, I would go on the book chat trail, and I wrote a book about Washington, and the Iraq War was just going and starting, and people would say, well, what would Washington say about Iraq?
Mm-hmm.
And I would first say, well, he's busy being dead. He can't come up and talk to you. But they would keep pushing me and say, well, what, if suppose, you read his stuff and you tell me what he would really think. And I said, well, after you briefed him on everything and you explained to him where Iraq was, I think what he'd say is, how did we become the British? And it exposes the fact that we began as an anti-imperial power. And it's deeply embedded in our DNA that we cannot replace Great Britain as a world power. We have to do it in a very different way. We can't have colonies. And it also means that any long-term American military commitment to nation building is likely to fail, whether that's in Iraq or in Afghanistan, because the patience of the public is going to be limited. And so those are the four guys and the reasons why I picked them.
All right. I want to go back and talk about the specific issues that you build around those four men. And I maybe focus most on Adams and Madison. But just to get back to the premise of the book itself, which is in your title, American Dialogue, is the very idea of dialogue in the sense of reasoned debate and sustained argument under challenge?
Yes. I mean, I think we occupy different bubbles now. We look at MSNBC or Fox News. We inhabit different apps. We have Facebook groups that agree with us and don't listen to people who disagree. And it's very difficult to have a serious civic conversation. And to that, I'm glad you asked the question, because the dialogue argument is at the center of the book. The Constitution is itself a framework for argument. It is not a set of answers. It's a framework in which we will contest, let's say, state versus federal authority, the power of the presidency. Those answers are not clear. Mm-hmm. They're deliberately ambiguous. That we have divisions that, to some extent, the Declaration locates sovereignty in the individual. The Constitution locates sovereignty in the collective whole, we the people. So that there's difference between the public and the people. The public is the long-term interest of the people, which at any given moment, polls will show that is not popular. There's different views towards government. Mm-hmm. Is government them or is government us? Well, both of those positions are embedded in the founding, and it's the interaction and dialogue between them that gives the energy and the vitality to the American experiment. And we've lost that energy because we no longer seem capable of representing both sides of the argument. And I think that my own view, and here the book Dark Money really is helpful in something that the dialogue has been distorted because money, and especially an anti-government ethos on the part of, let's say, originalists, but other people on the right, have prevented us from having this dialogue. And the New Deal itself is, for example, a social contract between capitalism and democracy. We will permit, it's not socialism, by the way. Mm-hmm. Socialism is government ownership of the means of production. There's very few socialists in America. You can find them in France and Germany and England, but there's very few real socialists, including Bernie Sanders in America. What the New Deal says is that we encourage the market to produce wealth, and we want a free market to generate wealth in the ways that only a free market can. But that wealth must be distributed so that there is a robust middle class, and that's the contract. That contract no longer exists. And the level of inequality that we have in the United States now is the highest of any advanced democracy in the world. Here is the country that invented the middle class and no longer is a middle-class society.
I want to go back to the Adams and inequality part, but the way that you're talking about the Constitution sounds like this supports Madison's notion of it as a living document. How then did this whole countervailing argument of originalism take hold? Was it with Scalia? Was it the Federalist Society? Was it earlier than that?
A little earlier than that. There was a movement to support corporations which felt that they were beleaguered because of the regulations that were being imposed on them by the New Deal and by the Great Society, and that there was a reaction against the liberal tradition and a need to develop an alternative to it. And the Koch brothers and other billionaires were funding this starting in the late 70s. That originalism is the legal product of that. Robert Bork was the first to develop the theory. And it's a weapon to essentially limit government control over the economy and regulation of domestic policy. There is a spectrum of opinion within the Federalist Society, and there are other think tanks that were created around us, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, the American Heritage Society. There are responsible intellectuals in each of those groups that are hardly ideologues, but the overarching premise underneath them all is an anti-government ethos. Mm-hmm. And the originalism is, and all of the nominees by Republican presidents since 1985 have been originalists. And both Gorsuch and Kavanaugh are extreme originalists. They're on the extreme right side of that. There's others, there's like a Mr. Ginsburg, who was once almost nominated for the court, who's a very sensible originalist. But the assumption of the originalists is that there is a single meaning back there that can be divined. And it's like Roberts' claim that I'm just an umpire calling balls and strikes. Well, baseball didn't exist, Judge Roberts, in 1787. Mm-hmm. And the whole point about the strike zone is the strike zone keeps changing. It's been expanding since 1787. In 1787, it didn't include men without property. It didn't include women. It didn't include blacks. It didn't include Native Americans. And so the whole point is that there's an expansive definition of what American rights are that are part of the living Constitution. And if you say, as Scalia did, I believe in the dead Constitution, what does that mean? So from my point of view, originalism is not just a plausible but contestable judicial philosophy. It's a preposterous position. And as someone who actually knows something about the history of the founding, if you want to go toe-to-toe with me on what Madison meant, I'm ready to go. But they don't really know anything about the history, and they don't think like historians.
Given that there was a dialogue at that time among the founders and a lot of debate, and of course the Federalist Papers, was there anyone representing anything that approximates that originalist view that is so beloved on the right among people like Neil Gorsuch?
No, that's the interesting answer. Nobody made the case that their views that they developed at that moment in 1787-88 ought to hold true for the next 200 years. Jefferson believed the Constitution ought to be redone every generation.
Mm-hmm.
Madison is an interesting character. He shifts his position 3 times over his life over basic issues. You could be an originalist and have a real diverse point of view if you just said you were Madisonian. There is no single source of truth back there to recover. It's a dialogue, as I said before. And in fact, the notion, Jefferson has a wonderful letter in 1816, and he said, I knew this generation, I was part of it, and for you in the future to hold our views as some sort of canonical truth would be like a grown man trying to wear the coat of a young boy. Jefferson has a kind of scientific view of truth as something that's going to keep evolving in the future, an Enlightenment figure in that regard. And in fact, the Federalist Society should be called the Anti-Federalist Society.
Right.
So the Federalist Papers are an argument for a federal constitution that locates sovereignty in the federal government rather than in the states. Okay, the Anti-Federalists are questioning that. They want us to remain a kind of confederation, a union of confederated states. That's the position that most of the people in the Federalist Society support. They are really anti-federalists.
I mean, you are so familiar with the primary sources in this period, the letters between Jefferson and Adams, the Federalist Papers, all the material around the constitutional conventions. Did you, in writing this book, find yourself looking at these documents in new ways, seeing things that you hadn't before because you're writing a very different kind of book about them?
To some extent, yes. To some extent, no. I didn't change my whole view of things, but that if you go back and look at Jefferson exclusively through the racial window, then, which is what I was intending to do here, you're not going to have a favorable view of him. Now, if you look through religious freedom, if you look through freedom of the press, if you look through lyrical prose, he's going to look great. And there's a famous line from JFK when he's having all these Nobel Prize-winning people for dinner at the White House and says, this is the greatest assemblage of talent in the history of this house, with the single exception of those evenings when Jefferson dined alone. There is room to be appreciative of Jefferson, but if you look through race, you're going to see the depth of our racism, and you're going to see it enshrined in a person who is very smart and very racist. I think that I've always loved Adams. He's a contrarian, and he's a biographer's dream because he tells you what he's thinking and feeling in his letters and in his diaries in a way that many of the other founders don't do. But his very contrarian mentality makes him immune to Jefferson's belief that freedom and equality can coexist harmoniously. If we just let people pursue their own happiness, it'll all end up in a harmonious group of people who share the wealth equitably. He doesn't really see that. And so it's not just his personality, but his own convictions about the future of America economically and politically that come forward under this look at Adams. With Madison, if you look at him in 1786, 87, 88, 89, he's one thing. If you look at him when he's president or later, he's a totally different thing. And there's different Madisons here, and they're obviously the same guy. But Madison is consistent in this sense. Whenever he sees the seesaw of American politics going too high in one direction, he jumps on to level it off. And that's what he keeps doing. That's what the Constitution is, an attempt to maintain balance among the parts of the Constitution and the different values underneath it. Washington, I wrote a book about him too. I think that this trades on that, but I now see his work in trying to resolve the Native American problem as an intriguing example, and he really does try to avoid Indian removal. Not enough people have given him credit for that. It fails, but that he recognizes that America cannot be a country which commits genocide on an indigenous population, that this would be a stain on our reputation and on his as well. And it's the reason why we cannot have colonies. It's the reason why we cannot be an imperial power in the same way that Britain was. That the republics are based on consensus. Empires are based on coercion. This is a contradiction that we're continually living right now. And looking at him as I did this time brings that to relief in a clearer way.
These concepts that you're talking about, the concept of a living constitution, the idea of inequality being sort of inherent to unregulated capitalism, the idea that there needs to be cooperation and for a realistic and effective foreign policy. For so long, these ideas, if they were debated and different views on them, but you're arguing that there is an act of historical fraud underway and pretty successful in its efforts. Why are these ideas now so vulnerable to attack?
Money. That money has gravitated to the political arena. I mean, in the first Gilded Age, Mark Hannes was asked, he was the Republican Senate Majority Leader, the McConnell of his day, how do you succeed? What are your political rules and principles? He said, well, there are two political principles. The first is money. Mm-hmm. I can't remember what the second is. And we're in that moment again. So it's a kind of forced amnesia of who we really are. And people will then say, well, Joe Ellis is really a socialist. I told you that's not true. I'm a conservative in many senses of that term. I'm a Republican in the small r sense, res publica, things of the public. I believe in evolutions rather than revolutions. I believe that we have to think about posterity as well as about ourselves. I believe that rights need to be balanced with responsibilities. I'm in favor of mandatory national service. And so that I consider those conservative principles, and what calls itself conservatism now isn't conservative. I don't know, they call it neoliberalism. I mean, I don't know what the proper term would be, but that I'm in favor of a set of principles that have historical standing and are the central dialogue that we have lived for 200 years and that we currently lost.
Well, I can't phrase it any better than that, so I will leave on those words. Joe Ellis, such a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks so much for making it possible.
Joe Ellis's new book is called American Dialogue, The Founders and Us, and it's reviewed this week in the Book Review by Jeff Schessel. And now we have Alexandra Alter here to talk about what's going on in the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What's new?
So the lawsuit between Barnes & Noble and its fired CEO, Demos Parneros, is dragging on. This week, Barnes & Noble filed a counterclaim against Parneros. He had sued them in August, claiming a breach of contract and defamation after he was fired for the unspecified reasons. That was later revealed that there were sexual harassment claims against him and that there was other conduct that they thought was inappropriate for a CEO. In their counterclaim this week, Barnes & Noble was actually seeking $1 million back from Mr. Parneros, and they included a lot more details about the circumstances under which he was fired. I thought the thing that was kind of most interesting, because it speaks to the larger future of the company and many of the problems that they've been having, was their claim that Mr. Parneros had somehow intentionally foiled this acquisition effort. There was another company that's not disclosed who the buyer was, but there was a potential acquirer for Barnes & Noble. And in a series of meetings, apparently, according to Barnes & Noble, Mr. Parneros intentionally sabotaged that because I think he saw that his own future at the company was in peril if this acquisition went forward. At least that's what they are saying in their counterclaim. And, this couldn't really come at a worse moment for the company. We're heading into the holiday season, which is the most important season for them. It's when they make most of their money. And, recently it was also reported that, the company is up for sale. So they're trying to make themselves look appealing to a potential acquirer. I think, publishers are very concerned about their future. Investors are concerned. There have been some rumors about who might acquire them and sort of maintain them. What Len Riggio really doesn't want, and he's the founder and chairman of the company, he is concerned about a buyer that might, take it and strip it for parts, kind of.
Right,
so what he really wants is, another bookseller or a company that will really take the brand and build on it and sort of keep their fleet of more than 600 stores.
All right, let's just give a bit of backdrop here. So Barnes & Noble, still the largest retail chain of bookstores in this country, really since the failure of Borders a number of years ago. But now you have Amazon entering in that space. You have the Canadian chain Indigo entering into that space. I think the question that so many people ask themselves is what's going on? What is the problem? Why is this company struggling?
It's such a hard to answer and fascinating question, and one that, as I said, publishers are really concerned about, particularly when you see print sales are totally stable, independent booksellers are doing better than they have in years, and, you continue to see them expanding. So the question is, in an environment where print is okay, book selling is not in peril, why is Barnes & Noble struggling so much? I mean, part of what some people have pointed to is just the challenges of all the CEO turnover. They've had a ton of turnover at the top, and they've tried a bunch of strategies. They've tried selling more toys and more games, and they tried to be sort of brand themselves as a lifestyle store where you could come in and learn coding. And I think the way that independents have flourished and the way you see a chain like Waterstones flourishing in the UK is sort of the curated aspect. So
Right.
let's reintroduce, let's make this a place for book discovery and have incredibly informed book buyers sort of putting themselves forward. And I think you do have individual stores in the Barnes & Noble chain that do that very well, I'm sure. But I think they need to and probably want to make that a focus again.
There was an interesting story, to your point, about Sarah McNally, one of the owners of the McNally Jackson bookstore, which recently found out they have to relocate their store from their existing location in downtown Manhattan. And there was a story about this in New York Magazine that pointed out that, she doesn't do the candles and the greeting cards and all of the gifty item stuff, but just has completely doubled down on being purely about books and curating in that space. And that seems to have been pretty successful.
Exactly. And I think there's other interesting examples of specialty stores. There's some independent stores that are really great. They have great kids sections. And so you see all the families going in. Or there's a store I saw that's opening in Brooklyn that's going to be focused on cookbooks and cocktail books. Which
That looks amazing.
Looked fantastic. So there's ways to go. But I think the thing that Barnes & Noble has always had as its secret weapon was the vast number of titles that they had. That's sort of how they conquered the market initially. They said, we have any book you want. We have all the books. So they need to somehow maintain that identity and at the same time say, we will help you find the right book the way that independents do.
And yet, at the same time, I have to say, there are those new sort of boutique versions of the Barnes & Noble store. And I visited one for the first time a couple of months ago. The focus was not actually on the number of books. They had things like vinyl being sold there and old-fashioned record players, but it was really nice.
Yeah, I think they're going to also have to do maybe something like what Waterstones has done, and Waterstones considers themselves to be a constellation of independent stores, not a chain. So I think Barnes & Noble is going to open up smaller stores that are more tailored to the markets that they're in, that reflect the sort of the community's interests and tastes, and probably have other larger superstores that are the ones that say, come in, we have everything. So,
all right. Well, you can never have too many bookstores, at least as far as I'm concerned.
I agree with you.
Alexandra, thank you.
Thanks.
Joining us now, our critics for the Times, Parl Siegel, Dwight Garner, and Jen Salai. Hey, guys.
Hi, Pamela.
Hi, Pamela.
So, Dwight, let's start with you. You reviewed 2 books this week.
Yeah, I was so happy reading this week. Lucia Berlin, who was this writer who wrote short stories in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, never quite broke through, with the quote-unquote quality lit crowd. Her stories were published by small magazines. They were published in book form by a very small publisher, and then a slightly large one called Black Sparrow Press in California. That's the press that published Charles Bukowski. And she had dalliances with major publishers, but never quite broke through. And now she's being revived. And she had a collection come out. Farrar, Straus and Drew published it in 2015 called A Manual for Cleaning Women. And that book just sort of, took my head off when I read it. I mean, these stories were just beautiful. There's sort of a blue-collar vein, struggling young women, newly married often, who end up working blue-collar jobs but long for better things, and men who don't always treat them very well. And there's been a new collection now called Evening in Paradise, and it's another collection of her stories. And also a nonfiction book called Welcome Home, which is an uncompleted memoir that she wrote. And also the book contains some letters. And that second book, Welcome Home, the memoir and the letters, is pretty minor stuff. The memoir is uncompleted, and the letters are interesting biographically, but not incredibly special. But, this writer, I think, just is sort of moved to the center of my own literary consciousness. She's a writer for me on the level of Raymond Carver or Grace Paley or Dennis Johnson. I mean, she deserves to be talked about in that company. It's funny, when I said at the start that I really had a great week reading it, as a critic, there are often these things you can't really talk about in your reviews. If you're a film critic, You can't really talk about the fact that this actress maybe has always been incredibly moving to you because the way her eyes or her teeth or her gestures remind you of this girl who broke your heart in third grade, and you can't say those kind of things.
I think you'll find a way, Dwight. I believe in you.
And as a music listener, there's a sound of certain kind of, maybe like a guitar sound that someone has, or it just gets to you. And something about Lucia Berlin's stories just shine a light on this part of existence that I feel like I know intimately, like sort of the places I've been, people I've known, situations I've been in, which I think is a universal feeling, but you have to take these personal feelings and sort of, try to make them universal in a review.
I think that what you're saying about that deep knowledge of that world or those psychic states, maybe you don't say it specifically, but I think reading your review, it comes across, right? There's like an intimacy. There's a way you're talking about the characters. You're not meeting them. You're re-encountering them, and you're seeing people brought to the page. And I think that suffuses that review.
It's been, I say in the start of my piece that it's been a great time for reissues in America. And there's so many houses doing it well, New York Review of Books primarily. But she's I think, the great find of this decade, for me at any rate.
Are there more stories or novels or what else is there?
There's got to be a few more stories, but she did not write a novel, to the best of my knowledge. She wrote 76 stories in her lifetime, and only, I would say, in these two books, A Manual for a Cleaning Woman and the new one, An Evening in Paradise, contain total maybe 25 or 30. So there has to be more out there, and I can't wait.
Jen, you were also very enthusiastic about the book you reviewed this week.
Yes, so this week I reviewed a memoir by a writer named Kiese Lehman, and the title is called Heavy. On the one hand, there's a very sort of literal meaning to the title because one of the main arcs of the book is about his own lifelong addiction to food and compulsive eating, as well as, on the flip side, an addiction to compulsive exercise and starvation. So his weight in the book, he goes from being an eighth grader who's over 200 pounds and struggling with that, and then he eventually starves himself down to being a grown man over 6 feet tall, 160 pounds, I believe, 159 pounds, and then he gains it all back again. So that's one part of the book. But also on an emotional level, it's also about, the weight of the past, the weight of his own personal past, the weight of the past of the country. And the main relationship in this book, and the book itself is addressed to his mother. Mm-hmm. And his mother raised him on her own as she was trying to get her academic career off the ground. She's a political scientist. And she gave him daily writing assignments where he would have to write about Fannie Lou Hamer or the radical Republicans. And if he didn't do it, she would beat him. And she would do it telling him constantly that the reason she was beating him was because in order not just to thrive, but simply to survive as a Black boy in Jackson, Mississippi, where he grew up, that he had to be excellent. And so what she was trying to do was teach him the importance of being excellent, of following the rules. And so, that is something that he's also reckoning with in this book. And he makes it very clear that even though it sounds like he doesn't talk to his mother that much anymore, mm-hmm. he really does love her very much. He still has a connection to her. And part of the purpose of this book is really to try to deal with that relationship very honestly, which, is a really difficult thing to do. And I mean, I was really impressed by it. I think it's a very, not just moving book, but also you see in the way it's constructed, because she gave him the tools to actually process or try to process what happened to him and what's going on in the world. And so in that sense, that is a gift. And I think he wants to be very clear that he's grateful for that. But at the same time, he wants to be honest about the kind of stuff that she put him through and, how for a child, how difficult that was. And there's that moment in the book where it's also very interesting because he was always a big kid, but where he gets to the point where he is big enough, he's so much bigger than she is, that he can grab the belt that she's about to use to hit him and say, no, you're not going to do this anymore to me.
I mean, reading your review was chilling and moving in itself.
The book, one of the things, and it was sort of hard to convey in the review, but one of the things that he even does is you see him because, one of the things she teaches him is how to revise his own work. I mean, I think the book, it seems to be a process of revision, and the book itself where he's revising his own memories and his thoughts about how he feels about things. And even within, not just within a paragraph, but in a sentence, you sort of see how conflicted he still feels, which I think to convey that, but to also have a book that makes sense and holds together, I mean, that's really quite an accomplishment.
It's interesting that he chose to subtitle it not a memoir, but an American
memoir. And actually, this was a conversation that I had with my editor yesterday as we were just doing the last minute stuff on it. And I had a sentence about it. And I'm still sort of two minds of how I feel about that, because one of the things he says actually right at the beginning is that he wanted to write something that was dishonest. He wanted to write something that was a lie because he knew that that's what his mother wanted, because that's what she always taught him, which is if you are too honest, if you try to be yourself, you will get hurt because people won't understand. So he says he wanted to do that. He also says that he wanted to write an American memoir. And then he says, but I wrote something that was a lie. You would have loved it, but I learned nothing. And so I'm writing this to you now. And so he goes through this book, which is tough on his mother, as, understandably it should be. But he did subtitle it an American memoir, which at the beginning is equated in a way with a lie. So, at the end of it, I wasn't sure if the implication was he tried to do something, but he feels that he came up short, or if he's trying to sort of rethink what an American memoir in this day and age could be or should be. He wrote a novel called Long Division, as well as a collection of essays that came out a few years ago, which is called, I think I'm going to get this right, How to Slowly Kill Yourself and Others in America. He already showed himself to be a very talented writer. The essays are even though they're shorter, they're much looser in a way than this book is. I mean, I do feel like this book, he really sort of went through it over and over again to come up with something. On the one hand, it doesn't sound too dense or stiff. It does move, but it definitely has the feel of something
repetitive, sort of revisiting trauma again and again and again.
Exactly.
Is that right?
But also, and also at the end of it, trying to come to an understanding. And just when you think that he's going to come out of it, one of the other addictions in this book is a gambling addiction, which his mother has, and he eventually develops a problem with it. And right near the end, you think he's going to come out of it. You think he's going to make peace with his mother. You think he's going to figure stuff out. And then right at the end, he sort of undercuts that. And so that, that was also very interesting to me.
I want to ask you a basic reviewing question. Is it harder to write a book that you feel pretty unequivocally enthused about than something that's more of a mixed or negative review?
I don't know. I guess I feel it's so book specific. I mean, I do feel like sometimes with certain books, when what they're doing is so much on the level of the sentence, but you can't quote too much for reasons of space, or else, you can't quote in such a way where it doesn't make sense. I mean, sometimes it can be hard, I think, to convey certain things. But actually, this was one of the things that Dwight and I were talking about earlier, about more in terms of negative reviews, whether that's easier, harder. I don't know. I mean,
but the hardest thing for sure is writing the middle review, the kind of book that's neither here nor there.
On the one hand or the other hand.
Yeah. You don't want to say that. It's a crime to write a boring review. So I try in general to find things to really like in that book and things to really dislike. And so to play up the extremes a little bit, maybe on occasion, just to
amp up the drama.
Just a little bit,
Yeah.
while remaining true to the book.
I find all writing difficult and awful. I find an email impossible.
Here. Yeah.
I don't know.
And yet you did review a book this week, Carl.
I did.
What did you write about?
Speaking of men and their bodies, I reviewed a brilliantly titled new biography and a brilliant biography of Nietzsche. It's called I Am Dynamite by Sue Prideaux, who in my review, I write, she's something of a specialist in male histrionic geniuses of the 19th century. She's written about Strindberg. She's written about Edvard Munch. And so she's written this biography of Nietzsche. There are so many biographies of Nietzsche. Like, there's like a major one that comes out, I think by my count, in the last 20 years, like almost every 4 years. His life is interesting. He was so powerfully misappropriated by nationalists and Nazis, courtesy of his sister. And all these, so these stories are pretty by now well known. And I think what Prideaux's great contribution in her book is that she handles all the serious stuff, but to write about Nietzsche, you have to have a sense of wit and of style and a sense of the ridiculous, because he certainly did. He was wonderfully funny. So she, sort of gives us the standard sort of story. She hits all the notes, but with it, she just has a sense of the man himself. I've never seen him emerge on the page the way I do in this book, with his blue lensed glasses and his ridiculous mustache, and I write about his beautiful manners. Like, he really does feel embodied in a way that feels very, very, very new to me. And I think that's what she was trying to do, is to sort of bring him to life, discuss him as an artist, as a literary stylist. I mean, and I do mention in my review, the philosophy gets somewhat short shrift. You don't really get the sense of what in this man's work has been so appealing to everyone from Nijinsky to Jordan Peterson. You don't really get that, but what you do get is something else in a way that's much more powerful, is that his style made him vulnerable. He alone of major philosophers advanced no school of thought, no system. It was a sensibility. It was a series of provocations. And a lot of that, courtesy of his sister and Heidegger and other people that sort of repurposed his writings and sort of created this other legacy, got lost. But she sort of restores that to us.
And yet we use Nietzschean to describe things.
Right.
Does she get into what do we mean by that? Or what do you think we mean by that?
Yeah, she does. I mean, I think that, he was somebody that, for all of the open-endedness in him and all of the clowning and joking, no, he definitely stood for, advanced particular ideas about the drive to self-enslavement and his contempt for religion and his contempt for submission of all kinds and his, so I mean, all these things are true, but what we do miss in him is that he's not as dogmatic as we would like to believe. He's not saying that, so even his idea of the Übermensch, he never describes him. He never says that this is exactly what he looks like or this. He's sort of describing a feeling. He's describing the conditions. And I think that that's something that is much harder to really talk about and to sort of to reckon with. But she does. And it's a biography. It sort of stutters in the beginning. It takes a while to find its footing. But once it does, speaking of Dwight, I had a nice week, walking the Alps with Nietzsche, cure to rescue. And speaking of people with bad bodies, his body was a torture chamber his entire life. He had everything from compulsive vomiting to these blinding headaches. And then she makes a beautiful point that his style was created because he was so ill. He had a moment of reprieve a month or something, so he would save up his thinking time and have these bursts of aphorisms, which is another thing I don't think I'd ever sort of really encountered in sort of chronicles of Nietzsche's life. But yeah, but she gets his suffering, but then she's also she gets that that life is also absolutely ridiculous, and we're kind of never more ridiculous than in the throes of pain and suffering and self-pity, which I really like.
All right, one last question for Dwight, because you have, Dwight, in front of you a very nice, well-worn mass market paperback copy of a book by Pauline Kael, Reeling.
Yeah, this is her book of reviews from the early 1970s. She reviews, The Godfather Part 2 and Shampoo and Last Tango in Paris. I don't know. I read her for inspiration once in a while. And I just one thing to say about this book, I can't believe the space the New Yorker gave her back in the 70s.
Yeah.
Some of these reviews are 8,000 words long. I mean, they just take on the whole world. But, whenever I need a shot of inspiration as a critic, she's, just so joyous to read.
Really, where do you guys go? Where do you go, Jen?
I think we talked about the Amos essays.
Yeah.
There's just something so pointed and direct, even though I don't always agree with the conclusions. But yeah.
I saw on social media that you were on a kind of Amos fiction.
Yes.
Oh. Have you seen London Fields?
No, but I'm going. Because now
Are you going to go?
You want to go with me?
Okay, give some background.
Just the London Fields is the second worst rating on Rotten Tomatoes. But better yet, the director, it's got terrible reviews. And then the director says, I have read the reviews and I agree with them. So it's
Even the trailer is terrible. I watched the trailer.
It's so bad. I did go on an Amos tear and I highly recommend it. I mean, not all of it holds up, but the stuff that holds up. I mean, you just it's the sentences, it's the sort of insouciance, it's the style.
Which book is your favorite, or which holds up the best?
I think the first book that I loved was The Rachel Papers, which is just so misogynist and awful, and yet so much fun. So, yeah.
Any Amos favorite, Jen?
Actually, for me, I think the last Amos fiction I've read was Yellow Dog.
Oh my God, that'll do it.
02, 03, something like that. So I would say the essays.
Dwight?
Well, you know, someone gave me when I was in college his collection of essays and reported pieces, I think called, there were two. One was sort of like Visiting Mrs. Nabokov.
Yeah.
And there was one before that whose name I'm forgetting. But someone gave them to me just as inspiration, and I couldn't believe how great they were.
He's so good.
So, for me, it was sometimes the nonfiction. But I look for him. If I see he's given an interview anywhere, I'll just go right there instantly because he just stray glints come off him just like dandruff come off me.
All right.
I don't have dandruff. I'm just making I wish.
Men in bodies.
Yeah.
All right. We end with one critic. Thanks to our three critics, Jen Salai, Dwight Garner, and Pearl Sagal.
Thank you.
Thanks, Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back. The Book Review Podcast is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with the great help of my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.